here in the perimeter, there are no stars. Out here, we is stoned, immaculate.
Hello and welcome. This is the C86 show. I'm David Eastaugh. As you know, we love a special guest. This week is going to be the turn of the designer and artist. It is Aubrey Powell, who was part of Hipgnosis with Storm, and they specialised in creating album covers for the likes of Pink Floyd, T-Rex, Black Sabbath, Led Zeppelin, AC/DC, and many more. He went on to do lots of videos as well, and he's still in the creative business. Anyway, this is the interview, and he's also got a book out which is titled Through the Prism, which is available from all good bookshops and also online. Do check it out. It is very, very good. But anyway, look, after several minutes of casual chat, we got down to that very exciting subject that was, well, I've been talking about sort of most artists and creative types often have a zeitgeist period, but sometimes struggle when their, moment has slightly gone and there's a new wave of creative people on the scene. So anyway, this is Aubrey's response to that fascinating point that I was making. Anyway, sit back, relax, enjoy.
I think it was difficult for all of us because with Hipgnosis coming out of a kind of era where the album cover was the most important thing apart from the album, into a kind of punk era where Jamie Reid developed Never Mind the Bollocks, Here's the Sex Pistols, which probably cost about £2. It was a bit of a shock. And also DVDs came along and CDs, which were about this big. And so suddenly that canvas of 24 inches by 12 inches was gone. So what was the interest for us?
Yes, it was interesting because I did an interview, not with Jamie Reid, but with the guy who curates his and sort of archives all his work last week, because he just brought a book out at the end of last year. So it's kind of interesting seeing the progression from your work in the 70s to that sort of suddenly the next decade or the next kind of phase goes on. Because the one thing I've noticed, because I've done a lot of interviews with bands, that most bands have a 5-year narrative where they're on the zeitgeist, if they're lucky, but then it's what happens next. And it also happens with producers, engineers, and obviously designers as well. So you must have had that experience with working with throughout the early 70s into that sort of punk and then the sort of 80s period.
Well, funnily enough, not really, because what happened was at the end of that kind of, as you say, zeitgeist of it was a 15-year period for Hipgnosis when we were on absolutely at the top of our game with doing album covers. Music video came along and we just transitioned into music videos and took all our clients, the Paul McCartneys, the Jimmy Page, the Robert Plants, all those sort of people, we took them with us into music video. And so it was a sort of transitional period. And we also took the kind of surrealist ideas that we've been using in Hipgnosis and put that into moving picture. And so it actually wasn't that difficult for us. We just moved right along. And I think the trick of any band or any designer in the music industry is to keep reinventing yourself and moving along with whatever's going along at the time.
Yes.
And that's the art of survival, which is why I'm still a creative director and still working 53 years later on.
Which is, yes, quite a run. But it's kind of always interesting how people kind of start their journey. And yours was in Cambridge, wasn't it?
Yes. I'm afraid to say it's often about who you know and the right time, right place. And the Pink Floyd, who were not the Pink Floyd at that time, Roger Waters, Syd Barrett, who were Cambridgeites, moved down to London, and later David Gilmour. And I was part of that whole circle of friends and also moved to London. And when Pink Floyd started, they made their first albums, Piper at the Gates of Dawn. Second album, they said, well, who are we going to get to do the album cover? We don't want our pictures on the front anymore like it was before and all that sort of stuff. And Storm Thorgerson, my partner in Hipgnosis, we put our hand up and said, how about us? And the next minute we knew was that they said, fine. And little did I know that Saucer Full of Secrets, the first album cover we did, would lead on to other things and Dark Side of the Moon in 1973.
Yes.
After our career went...
It did. So what was your kind of 60s period like? Because, obviously from the Philip Larkin poem, you know, the 60s started about 63 with the first Beatles album and Lady Chatterley's Lover. And then you had this kind of explosion, which by 67 was, you know, in San Francisco, there was the Gathering of the Tribes. Then we had the 14-hour Technicolor Dream at Ali Pali in 67 with Pink Floyd and Yoko Ono and probably Arthur Brown because he was everywhere. So did you also go through that kind of period of kind of exploration and kind of interest?
Without doubt. I think when I was at school, which was in the early 60s, you know, I was already into what I call the Beatnik Phase, and very much into people like Allen Ginsberg, the poet from San Francisco, reading Howl magazine, City Lights Review, all that sort of alternative world, if you like, when I was only sort of 14 or 15. And so it was a kind of natural progression that when I left school and found myself living in Cambridge, that I gravitated towards Storm Thorgerson, my partner in Hipgnosis, and his group of friends, because everybody was into the same sort of thing, into the movies of Louis Buñuel, you know, sort of into the art of René Magritte, or into Salvador Dali, this kind of movement towards interesting and alternative ways of seeing things. And of course, that involved taking LSD, etc., you know, and that sort of opened our eyes to a more interesting environment, not just stuck in the same old conservative movement, which had come from the Second World War, and which my parents were a part of. And many middle-class people aspired to for a sense of security, and I was not interested in that, and nor were the people that I was hanging around with, you know. But if you ask about music, my music at that time was the Small Faces, the Who, you know, all those sort of bands and the Rolling Stones, which had really come up with interesting stuff at the time prior to Pink Floyd. And we were sort of, in a sense, innovators of the early 60s.
Yes. And did you, at that stage where the 60s sort of comes to an end, you know, as things like Altamont and Charles Manson, and then you had the death of, you know, Jimi Hendrix, Jim Morrison, Janis Joplin, and the year before Brian Jones, did that feel a little bit kind of like, oh, was that the party over? Because I've done interviews with people like Joe Boyd and Barry Miles, and I sort of asked Barry, you know, what happened to you in the 70s? He said, we were just already tired. We just couldn't keep it going. We just wanted to sleep, which kind of seemed like quite an honest answer, really. So did you feel a bit like, oh, that's that the establishment did say it was all going to finish and they're right? Or did you sort of have a kind of creative or kind of excited, no, this isn't the end, I've got the baton, we're the next generation coming along?
100%. Storm and I took the baton and ran with it. I was not interested in being held back by the kind of hippie schmippy kind of vibe. It wasn't my scene. I wanted to make money. I wanted to be famous. I wanted to make art. I wanted to do interesting things. And there were people out there like Peter Blake, who'd done Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band album cover for the Beatles. And I just saw an opportunity with Storm and thought, this is the way forward. And I didn't for one second look back and think those were wonderful, heady days. I just simply didn't, nor did Storm. We were too interested in getting on and creating interesting visuals. And I don't know. I sort of left that world very quickly. And also, I'd seen casualties. I shared a flat with Syd Barrett, who, as we know, sadly, one of my best friends had, a terrible time with LSD and went kind of mad, I suppose. And I didn't want to go down that route. I thought, you know what? No, that's not for me. And Storm felt the same. And, we started a company and started to be serious about the work that we did. Yes. And think laterally, not putting a photograph of the band on the album cover with the title and the name of the band, boring. So I think it was an opportunity and we took it.
And what was that relationship? Because Storm is kind of like a lot of great kind of artistic movements and probably business have a kind of partnership. Storm is amazingly important, but his childhood was also quite interesting because he went to the famous A.S. Neal School, didn't he, Summerhill, which is kind of in this area. So was he quite an unusual character when you first met him?
When I first met Storm, which was during a drug bust on his mother's house, which was kind of a strange thing, but we immediately formed a bond, and because I didn't run away, I suppose. But I realized that he was a fellow who he thought completely out of the box. He was not your usual run-of-the-mill university student at that time. He was incredibly intelligent, incredibly intense, with a wonderful sense of humor. And I realized also that he was somebody who could help me. And he was my mentor for the first 2 years in Hipgnosis. There's no question about that. He had a grasp of, I think, what one would call an alternative world. And this definitely came from him going to Summerhill. Summerhill A.S. O'Neill School was very much alternative thinking. It was a place where you did what you wanted to. You had no rules. If you attended class, you could. If you didn't, you didn't. And I think this gave him, I think Nick Mason summed it up well. He said he was a man who couldn't take yes for an answer. And I think that's absolutely right. If you said to Storm, yes, I like that, he'd argue 360 degrees for about 4 hours as to why it wasn't right. And he was just one of those extraordinary characters. But out of that came some absolute spurts of genius. And he was very difficult to work with. And he and I had many fights. But that 15 years together as Hipgnosis, which is what I write about in the book, was probably one of the most sort of inventive, cooperative, and exciting periods in my life.
Yes, I can see it. I went to one of those workshops, Tony Robbins, one of those how to, I don't know, help your life or empower yourself. And he said you are the kind of percentage of the people you hang out with. He said it better than that, but you know what I mean. You are kind of, the reflection of the people you hang out with is going to have a big impact. So obviously, hanging out with, Syd Barrett, Pink Floyd, that artistic scene, and Storm, obviously reflects also on the people you're choosing to be with. What were they like? What was Syd? Did you sort of find Syd an interesting creative character, or was that not? Was he quite different to Storm?
Very different from Storm. Syd was a very sensitive, bubbly, sweet guy who walked around always on the balls of his feet, often no shoes on, often stripped to the waist. He was always inventing things. I always remember one day I walked into his room in Earlham Street in London when he was still at the Hornsey College of Art. And I remember him taking, there was a bare light bulb, and he simply took a brown paper bag, ripped the top off, and just curled it around the light bulb. And there was this beautiful soft light. I thought, oh my God, that's so simple and so clever. And yet that was Syd. I mean, if you walked into his room in Cambridge, where his mother's house was, the room was covered in dodecahedrons he'd made out of balsa wood, incredibly complex, very difficult to make. But for Syd, it just seemed sort of like natural. I mean, he was a very natural painter. I call him, I suppose, a 60s Renaissance man. He could turn his craft to anything, singing, playing guitar in a unique way with that Zippo lighter, creating those early kind of Pink Floyd space rock sounds. He just was a very gentle, beautiful person. And it was extremely sad that we lost him in a world of LSD fug, basically.
It was horrendous. So then how did you sort of start the company, and how did you sort of manage to maneuver and sort of find yourself on the zeitgeist of this kind of early 70s period? Because obviously there'd been the rise of I suppose you'd had those garage bands, and then you had the singer-songwriter period, and then the glam period of Sweet and Slade and, David Bowie. So there was quite a lot of new artists coming along, as well as kind of the heavy rock scene with people like Deep Purple and Black Sabbath. So how did you sort of manage to sort of navigate your way into that kind of aura?
Well, I think like anything else, it's luck, bit of talent, and being in the right place at the right time. And I think when we started doing things with Pink Floyd, like Saucer Full of Secrets, going on to things like Atom Heart Mother, just with a picture of a cow with no name of the band and no title, and very surrealist ideas, really, and a kind of Dadaist movement in a sense that we were after. People took notice, and suddenly the phone started to ring. We had a studio in Soho, and suddenly people like Jimmy Page were phoning up. Suddenly people like Paul McCartney were phoning up. We've seen what you've done. We'd be interested to work with you. Can we collaborate? And sure enough, we did. And luckily, people accepted our ideas, which were often nothing related to the music or to the lyrics or to the title of the album. There were simply ideas that were definitely off the wall.
Yes.
And I think that was important then. You have to remember that if you went to a record emporium like Tower Records, there were 10,000 albums facing you. And if you could possibly catch somebody's attention with the album cover, this was kind of important. And album covers were seen to be important at that time.
Well, I was going to say, because I got a brother, I was born in 1964, but my brother's 7 years older, and he was perfect for the prog rock world, really, of, yes, Genesis, Wishbone Ash, Barclay James Harvest, the solo work of Rick Wakeman, and also Pink Floyd. So obviously I used to sneak into his room when he said, don't go into my room to play my records, and play his records and be mesmerized with these albums, and they were just otherworldly. When you're about 11, 12, they are just absolutely out there. And it's kind of interesting how important they represented. And he was the sort of person who refused to have a 7-inch single because you weren't a proper music fan with that. And you'd buy the plastic kind of cover that you put on the album as well, so you wouldn't even get a little smudge on your fingers. You had to wash your hands. You learned to wash your hands before touching his records, really, because he'd sort of look at them. So they represented more than just music. They represented the person, didn't they?
Well, I think buying an album in the 1970s, you were sort of, you went to a record shop on a Saturday afternoon and you picked the album you wanted, and then you looked for something else because you could afford 2 albums that week. And you took them home, and it was like a Holy Communion. You broke the seal, you took the album out of the inner sleeve, you then placed it on the deck, you put the stylus on the thing, and first of all, you heard before it started to play the music. And then you sat back in your chair and you opened up the album cover, which was a gatefold, 24 inches by 12 inches, big canvas to look at, and you studied it. You wanted to have some signpost as to what your favorite band was all about. What were they up to? Because you have to remember, there was probably only 3 rock and roll newspapers. There was probably 2 TV programs, Grey Whistle Test and Top of the Pops. And that was about as much information as you were going to get. And so the album cover was a sort of, Bible of what was going on with the band at the time. And sometimes it was extremely esoteric and very sort of unrelated to the band. But if you could fathom it out, then you were pretty smart. And often Hipgnosis did things that were nothing to do with the band at all. Led Zeppelin, A Black Object for Presents,
Yes.
What's that all about? Well, there is some logic behind it. But it was intriguing. It generated curiosity from the fan, and I think if you could engage people like that, then you had succeeded in the art of the record cover.
Yes, there was also 2 other things. You used to sniff the record because it always smelled so good when you bought it new, and then got very neurotic about it being slightly warped. Absolutely. And just watch the needle go, oh my God, it's warped. What shall I do? Don't panic, don't worry. Don't put it in the oven, try and make it level. That's a disaster. People did try it, didn't they? Yeah, so at the time then, you came up with, like The Cow, and then the amazing Pink Floyd, Dark Side of the Moon, and then probably, would you say Wish You Were Here was your moment that you felt, was one of your favorite album covers?
For me personally, it was. Wish You Were Here was one of those opportunities to really indulge in our fantasies. Dark Side of the Moon, to me, was not one of my favorite album covers. I mean, I always remember when we came up with the idea and going to show the band, and Storm said to me, this isn't really us because it's a graphic design. And we had to call in the talents of George Hardy, who worked with us a lot and was an extremely good illustrator, to actually draw it out. And so for me, although it's probably the most iconic image that Hipgnosis ever did, it's not one of my favorites. And one of my favorites goes forward to that, to Wish You Were Here, where I was sort of given carte blanche as a photographer to take Storm's ideas and do what I wanted with them. And in those days, for a band to spend $50,000 on an album cover was not unheard of. And you have to remember that albums sold in tens of millions.
Yes.
So the industry was awash with money, and we never worked for the record companies, only for the bands. And so, you know, when Storm suggested to Pink Floyd at Abbey Road, you know, we want to set a man on fire, they all just sort of went, oh, yeah, okay, great. You know, it was just, oh, and by the way, we want to do a diver in some lake in California. Oh, by the way, you know, it was like Dark Side of the Moon too, you know, when Storm said, well, we want to go to Egypt and photograph the prince. Okay, well, you just better get on with it, you know. You couldn't do that now, you know, not unless it's a very grand band. But in those days, the innovativeness of album covers was as important as making the music in a way. I mean, I'm not being pretentious about that, so please don't get me wrong. But it turned out that way. And I didn't think about it, nor did Storm at the time. We were too busy moving from one job to another. We were producing probably a new album cover every 2 weeks. And these album covers took a long time to make, 6 weeks, 2 months, something like that. Because
did you start to treat the business more like the Andy Warhol model of trying to encourage people to work with you sometimes? I mean, David Bowie being one of those artists who were brilliant, but you noticed he was always kind of working with some good producers or good musicians and then bouncing ideas and then coming out with the next album. And amazingly, you know, the 70s did one album a year, produced several albums, relocated, did world tours. I mean, pretty busy time. So you must have had that same momentum in the 70s.
Absolutely. I mean, what started out as a studio in Soho with just Storm and me in a space, within a very short period of time turned out to have, you know, graphic designers working with photographic darkroom assistants, a whole plethora of people. And I suppose after 1973, after Dark Side of the Moon, when we were doing so much work, it became like an art factory. And Warhol is a very good example. I'm glad you mentioned him, because it felt a bit like that, where Storm and I were sort of in control of the creation and the art part, but actually we needed all these other people to help us. People like George Hardy, Colin Elgie, who was an illustrator, people like Richard Evans, who was a graphics guy. You know, we needed all these people to help us on the road. And there's no question that without them, we could not have succeeded. It became an art kind of community. And I always remember we used to meet twice a week, about 9 o'clock in the evening at Storm's apartment, because he had a son to bring up. And the meetings would go on until about 2 in the morning. And everybody would turn up, and it was a bit sort of like a sort of therapeutic session. Everybody would throw in their bits and pieces, and Storm would suddenly say, "Oh, I've got an idea." I mean, I remember, for example, Led Zeppelin Presence with the Black Object. I remember sitting there with Peter Christopherson, who was Throbbing Gristle, who was a partner in Hipgnosis, Storm, myself, and George Hardy, who was a very well-known graphic designer. And they all started talking about having a cocktail party where everybody had a black cat. And we all thought, well, Led Zeppelin, that all sounds a bit naff. And then suddenly Storm said, what about 2001, where the black object at the end becomes so important in Arthur C. Clarke's book and the movie? And then George Hardy said, oh, how about this designer? And it was all kind of like that. Everybody threw something into the melting pot. And out of that recipe came a success. And I remember when I took that black object to Munich to show Led Zeppelin, all I had was a black object and some pictures from an old National Geographic magazine. I put them on a table in the middle of a hotel suite, and Jimmy Page walked in and said, I get it, that's it. You know, and even today, I saw Jimmy the other day, even today we talk about the magic of that moment, and it was just, you know, the ideas were so off the wall. Who'd expect that for a very heavy rock band, who are the biggest band of the time, to do something quite so esoteric and strange?
Yes,
but they got it.
And did you, with you and Storm being this kind of, like a very solid relationship, did you complement each other and sort of work on each other's kind of strengths and say, and also know each other well enough to say, look, you're not great in these situations, but you're great in those situations? Were you quickly able to sort of complement each other, knowing who to talk, how to talk to people and how to navigate those situations?
I think because Storm was a couple of years older than me and far more, far more intelligent than I was, Actually, he was my mentor for the first couple of years in Hipgnosis. There's no question about that. But after that, I very much took the lead, because Storm was a person who was argumentative, antagonistic, and incredibly rude to people. And consequently, he fell out with people like Paul McCartney, he fell out with Jimmy Page, and many others. There were other people who absolutely gravitated to him, like Peter Gabriel, who adored Storm and loved the tussle and to and fro of the argument. I remember seeing Storm and him in an argument about, I think it was Scratch, the album cover, where
oh yes,
tracking himself and talking about which was the best picture, that went on for about 4 hours and got quite heated. But Peter loved that sort of banter with Storm. Other people, Paul McCartney couldn't handle it at all. He just said, no, I'm not working with him, I'm working with you. Because I was diplomatic. I was, polite. I was sort of wanting to work with them and wanting to get the job done. Whereas Storm was all about content. The content mattered more to him than the style. But I had the style and was the photographer. But when you match the two things together, we complemented each other. I mean, there's very little difference between Lennon, McCartney, Liam and Noel, and Mick and Keith. There's always that friction between creative people to get what they want. And actually, at the end of the day, that's what leads to success. And I think when you have two people on board who have very defining roles and are as stubborn, as obstinate as each other, at the end of the day, you get magic. And that's what we mean.
This is what happens with a lot of my favorite bands from the 80s. But did you find then, sort of as 76, you'd sort of certainly, surfing the zeitgeist and suddenly must have felt good. Then when, Malcolm and McLaren came along, Jamie Reed, the punk movement, very different sound, very different sort of attitude. Did that sort of feel quite interesting to you, and the company at that stage?
Well, I'll tell you something. The funny thing is that the Sex Pistols used to rehearse right behind Hipgnosis studio. And Malcolm McLaren, I knew because I lived in Chelsea from having Seditionary and all of that. And they used to annoy the hell out of me. I mean, Peter Christopherson, again, who was Throbbing Gristle and who was friends with the Sex Pistols, particularly with John Lydon, took the first photographs of them and stuff like that. And I was kind of scathing. I was still the old hippie playing Crosby, Stills and Nash in the studio, while the Sex Pistols would be belting out, sort of really bad cover versions of the Small Faces, And John Lydon and the other guys, we used to meet in the corridor downstairs because we shared the same front door. And what started out in about 1976 as sort of opening the door for each other, finished up sort of a year later with John Lydon wearing "I Hate Pink Floyd" t-shirt. And I remember confronting him saying, "What the fuck's that?" And he said, "Well, I do hate Pink Floyd, so you can fuck off." I thought, okay, the lines are drawn. And Malcolm, I saw just prior to their first gig that they played, he said, "Hey, listen, the band are playing tonight. You've got to come along, blah, blah, blah. Peter Christopherson's coming to it." And I said, "No, I'm not interested." And I regret it to this day. I didn't go to the first Pistols gig. It was such a stupid piece of arrogance on my behalf.
Yes, it's tricky, isn't it? But then as we were trucking up to the sort of the late 70s, Margaret Thatcher gets in, and then there's the Falkland War, the miners, Greenham Common, then slowly, we've got other issues that bring up with the 80s. How did your relationship with the company and Storm continue through into another decade?
I think one of the things about the late 70s was it was a miserable period of time. I mean, I can remember 3-day weeks when we didn't have electricity and everybody had to sit around by candlelight in the freezing cold. I remember the piles of garbage. I mean, I remember going to see Paul McCartney at 1 Soho Square. MPL was his company. And the center of Soho Square was piled probably 15 to 20 feet with garbage in black plastic bags, and there were rats running everywhere. You can't imagine the kind of poverty and uncomfortableness that London represented at that time. It was not a great period of time to be in London at all. And I think part of that is what generated, of course, the Sex Pistols and their appeal to working class boys and girls who could not possibly aspire to the things that some of the prog rock innovators wanted, Learjets and fame. And I always remember that I think it was Peter Saville who designed everything for New Order. And
that's right, yeah, the factory.
Very well known. I remember him saying to me once, what the fuck have pigs flying over power stations got to do with 15-year-old kids of today? And I sort of poo-pooed it and said, hey, I'm employed. I'm doing the thing that I'm employed to do, and I'm loving it. And he was like, well, you wait and see. Sure enough, what happened? Punk started, and Jamie Reed started, and Jamie Reed probably made Never Mind the Bollocks, Here's the Sex Pistols for about £2. And I was used to $50,000 budgets. I saw the writing on the wall that very soon that was all going to disappear. Not so much for the clients that we had, but then, of course, in the late 70s, along came CDs, which were, tiny, about 5 inches. And Storm, I think, was the first to recognize that our heady days of album covers were over. The salad days were finished. And he said to me, it's time to get out of here, and we need to start making music videos, which MTV had started. And sure enough, against my better wishes, we did. And we had huge success with that. So we made the transition from still pictures and album covers into music video. And that was the best thing we ever did.
My God, that was such a good move, wasn't it, really? And how did you sort of navigate that period? Did you sort of suddenly go, right, how do we make this? I mean, who mentored you during that period?
Thing was that before Hipgnosis started, Storm was at the Royal College of Art studying film, and he'd always made films for himself. I mean, really fascinating little films, little 10-minute movies. But when I look back at them, they were really way ahead of their time. He was a very good director. So when we moved into, I remember the first music video we made was Wherever I Lay My Hat, That's My Home, for Paul Young. And it was a narrative script, which was very popular in those days. And Storm did a brilliant job. And the next minute, Paul Young's got a hit on his hand. So have we on MTV. Next thing, Robert Plant calls up and says, oh, I've got a new album. It's Big Log. I want to do something in California. So suddenly we're in LA shooting in California. Next thing, Jimmy Page phones up. I formed a band called The Firm with Paul Rodgers from Bad Company. It just escalated from there. Asia, I remember, came along and we shot a film with them. John Wetton, who was a friend of mine, said, oh, we have to do this. And the budgets were huge. I remember for The Firm, we made 3 films for £600,000. Can you imagine that kind of money in around about 1982, 83, 84? The next thing was we were making feature films. We made a feature film with Barry Gibb called Now Voyager, because he wanted to break away from the image of the Bee Gees and become a serious actor, which didn't quite work out, but nevertheless. And we found ourselves, it just one thing, one hand washes the other in that world. And we took a lot of our clients with us who were from the album cover world into the music video world.
Yes.
So it was serendipity and right time, right place. And we were lucky.
And how did you and Storm, when did you part?
Well, it became very acrimonious between I and Storm, and it was extremely sad for me because basically Storm became the director. I had already been the photographer in Hipgnosis, and Peter Christophson had been somewhere in between as the lighting cameraman, and we wrote the ideas all together and stuff like that. And Storm became very difficult as a director, wanting the world when the money wasn't there. And so it became very abrasive between, the relationship of producer director is never great because the producer is always trying to save money, the director is always trying to spend it.
Yes.
So we'd have a $200,000 budget and Storm would spend $250,000, and I was tearing my hair out and I couldn't control him. It became untenable, and of course the company got into financial problems. He and I confronted each other one day and I said, I can't go on like this. But the reality was that I wanted to direct myself because I knew I could. And so after much gnashing of teeth and acrimony, Storm and I didn't speak to each other for 12 years.
My
and
God.
I went on to have a successful film company, and he carried on making a few films, but then went back to doing album cover design, which is what he really loved doing, and very well he did at it too. That's what he really loved doing.
And if you could have said something to your 16, 18-year-old self starting out back then, I mean, it was, with the experience that you've had, is there anything that you'd have wanted us to have whispered in their ear, even if they ignored you?
Hard work. I mean, when Hipgnosis started, I think we probably worked 7 days a week, 14 hours a day. And I'm not exaggerating. It was a labor of love. And gathering around you a team of people you trust to work with you is everything. And somehow we've managed to encapsulate that. But for the first 10 years of my working life, unfortunately, most of our private lives disappeared. Storm had problems, I had problems, all the rest of it. And I think we put the work and Hipgnosis first. And when you're dedicated to the work, and first of all, it's so much fun, but secondly, it's quite a serious business. And I don't just mean financially, I'm talking in terms of the art of it. Something's got to give, and it's hard work.
Yes.
I would say to somebody, don't expect somebody to give you something they don't. Work, and you'll receive the rewards. Do
you slightly regret, though, the commitment you had to make and the sacrifices during that period?
53 years later, I'm exactly the same as I was then. The work comes first before everything. I work as hard as I ever did, and I'm absolutely dedicated to my profession, and I love every minute of it. And the other thing is, I'm so respectful of people like Pink Floyd, of Robert and Jimmy, of the Rolling Stones, of Peter Gabriel, of giving us the opportunity to do the work that we wanted to do. And it was trust. They trusted us, and they still do. And that to me is everything. And
you must be really pleased that the album has now become back in vogue as well as popular now. Well, not as popular now as it was then, but obviously people are taking it seriously in the conversation as well. You have this artwork. It's not just this little plastic thing, it is a proper piece of art. So it must be nice to realize that your work is got another audience decades later, a completely new audience as well, that's been seeing it as it was back in the 70s.
I'm so flattered by the fact that people take so much interest in the work that we did in the 1970s. And in fact, I have 5 or 6 exhibitions traveling through Europe, all with sort of 50 to 80 pieces of work in there. And I've got a huge retrospective in Holland at the Groningen Museum in January with 140 pictures in it. So the album cover, the world of the album cover design has been taken very seriously now. And that is a great accolade, both to Storm, who sadly departed, and to me, and I'm forever grateful for it.
Yes, and just last question: is there a particular album cover that you think, wow, that is, it really impressed you, that wasn't one of your own?
Yes, I do. I think there were various album covers that I really liked, and I wish I could have done. One was, funnily enough, The Doors' Strange Days.
Right, yes.
A picture of a kind of surrealist image of a dwarf and a juggler and a showgirl. And it just sort of came across at the time as something that I thought Storm and I could have done. And I wish we'd worked with them. And the other person I wish I could have worked for was Bob Dylan, but we never did. So, there have been moments where I've seen album covers that I thought were just wonderful. I thought those people we could work for.
Anyway, look, it's going to go ping because we only have 40 minutes. I think I've got a lot there. So I'm really grateful for that. That's been and there you go. That was the end of the call. That was me. I know, so professional. Anyway, look, that was me in conversation with Aubrey Powell, who was part of Hipgnosis with Storm, and yes, has this new book out, which is called Through the Prism. Available, as I said earlier, from all good bookshops, also online. Do check it out. It's a really interesting read with lots of interesting facts, figures, and obviously pictures. But this has been the C86 show. I'm David Eastaugh. If you want to contact me for some nice and groovy reason, you can on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. kind of. Just do C86 show, you'll find it. And also, which is fascinating, all these have been archived, and you can find those on Spotify, iTunes, Podbean. Anyway, that's life. Have a great week. Stay safe.